I would very briefly like to discuss risk management and quality review. The reason I say briefly is that this topic is discussed at length in your quality improvement class. I think it's HIT 254. And so I just want to hit on just a few things in regard to this particular subject. And I'm also going to talk for just a minute on compliance programs. But with risk management, as far as the concept of risk management, it is managing financial risk. Where when we talk about quality improvement, we're talking about quality of patient care. But with risk management, that's another category in which there's some individuals who are responsible for trying to manage financial risk for the hospital. And you'll hear about fiscal risk, FISCAL, same thing. But that's what risk management involves. So it's basically the bottom line, the dollar. And there's many ways in which hospitals or healthcare facilities may lose money or be at risk for losing money. And as we've discussed throughout this course, lawsuits. There can be many, many ways in which the hospital could be at risk for losing funds. And so with risk management, the only thing I really want to discuss as far as risk management goes, it's a process. And this particular textbook takes you through the process, which is basically 4 steps in the risk management process. And once we go over them, hopefully it'll say, oh, okay, that makes sense. It's like when you tackle any other problem, you have to start and go at it methodically. And so within risk management, the very first thing that has to be done is the identification of risk. Now, with this, it's the process of identifying activities that potentially expose an organization to the risk of liability or financial loss. So we can't address those or deal with them until we know what they are. And so risk identification could be, as I've mentioned before, a patient fell out of the bed. That's a risk because we risk being sued for that, and we risk losing money. So identify things that put the facility at risk. It could be an accident waiting to happen. It doesn't mean that something actually had to happen, that there's a risk there that something could happen. So we have to identify our vulnerable spots. We have to identify where risk can be. And then the next thing in this process, and something that I did fail to say is that there's usually a position in the facility. That position is called risk manager, and that individual is over this process. Doesn't necessarily mean that this goes on in the health information department, but it is a part of hospital business where we have quality improvement. We also have risk management. They are 2 different things, but there's usually a risk manager who will be responsible for this. The next thing is risk evaluation. Not all risks pose a problem, or I say potential for a large financial risk. And sometimes the solution is going to cost way more than just leaving the risk there, because the risk may be very minimal. So evaluating the risk, what are the benefits and the drawbacks of the way that we address different risks that we've identified. So just the process of using analytical skills, examining the risk to determine the potential for risk and the financial impact that the risk could have on a particular organization or practitioner. Risk managers will often try to predict what could be expected as a loss or how frequently. Something may be a rather large risk, but the chances of something actually happening from that risk are very minute. So if tons and tons of money and time are spent to eliminate that risk, it may not be worth it in the long run. Now, the third thing is risk handling. Once a risk has been identified, it's been evaluated to determine the best way to handle it, then that's the next part in the step. That is to actually handle the risk. The process of taking steps to respond to the risks that have been identified, And a lot of times risk managers will analyze available methods for reducing exposure and potential losses and implement an appropriate course of action. And so this is just after the planning phase. This is basically putting the plan into action. Now, risk monitoring, the last thing in the process, or the last of the 4 steps, is the process of continuously monitoring and evaluating the results of the risk management initiatives. You'll find, especially in quality improvement and with all other things, is when we plan for anything, we do it, we implement our plan A, for example. We go back, we don't always say, oh, well, we solved that, don't need to look at it anymore. We have to go back and monitor and make sure that the decisions we made in any circumstance are actually working. Sometimes we'll assume they're working in a particular way, and they're not. So think of this as the same as follow-up. You'll hear that term time and time again, especially in your quality improvement class. So it's monitoring to make sure that the way that a risk was handled is actually working out as it was planned. Also, another thing I want to talk about, and I'm sure this is touched on in several classes, but it's kind of like a catchphrase now. You hear about compliance, compliance, compliance. And each facility now will have what's called a compliance program. And so far, even though you've not been in the program for a ton of time, you've heard about all the different rules and regulations and standards and laws that we have to abide by in healthcare. And so what a compliance program is pretty much just one department or one program within the facility that monitors all of those laws, those regulations, those standards, and makes sure that we have systems in place to address our compliance with those laws and rules and standards. So that's all that a compliance program is. And so it's basically in response to the many, many, many different things that we have to make sure that we are in compliance with. Now, when we have a compliance program, and you'll hear the term also compliance officer, and that's just the individual who is in charge of the compliance program. But within an organization, and you'll hear the term corporate compliance, it's just an organization's compliance plan has to consider all the laws, the regulations, the standards that affect that particular organization. And it's headed by the compliance officer. And so among the many, many things that need to be considered, we've talked about laws in hiring and firing in HIT 255, the management class. We've talked about the Family Medical Leave Act. We've talked about COBRA and OBRA and Safe Medical Devices Act. We've talked about federal laws and fraud and abuse and Medicare conditions of participation and Joint Commission standards and state licensure laws. It's just, think of it as a clearinghouse, a place where all of this, somebody is keeping track of all of this and also heading up the program to make sure that we are addressing and we are in compliance with all of these laws and rules and regulations. More examples, the ADA, again, I mentioned the Fair Labor Standards Act. You know, we've talked about that in HIT 255 to make sure that everybody that works over 40 hours or 80 hours in a 2-week period is getting time and a half, and that there is a minimum wage and we are complying with that minimum wage, that nobody in the facility is making under that amount of money. But in the Patient Self-Determination Act, we talked about that not too long ago. And so we have to make sure that we're complying with all of the different components of that particular act. But also, in addition, there are tax laws. We don't even usually in the health information department, we don't worry about the tax laws involving the facility. Somebody else worries about that. But still, we have to be in compliance with those laws. So again, that's what corporate compliance is about. That's what the compliance officer deals with. So I just wanted to touch on a few of these things because you hear these terms regularly. But again, these will be covered more completely in other courses.